Welcome everybody to our film today, a film of pedagogical documentation. We are group 2 and we hope you will enjoy our film. So today we will go through 3 steps. The first one is what is the pedagogical documentation, the second one is our journey through the documentation process, and the third one is our references. So what is the pedagogical documentation?
What is pedagogical documentation? So first, the word pedagogic is very significant to understand the difference between the pedagogical document and other forms of documentation. Pedagogical is defined as the study of teaching, that is, what is done to enable teaching to occur. In other words, it can be understood as the way we teach and make a specific decision on what we do. Also, knowing what the meaning of the documentation is a very initial step to understand the process. Documentation is the action to keep a record of events. When educators document children's learning, it means they keep a record of proof for their learning. Documentation serves as a historical record of past events and bring us vital ideas for next coming experience in the future, tomorrow, as well as a means for a shared evidence with children's family or other staff in the early year setting, that we work together to support young children's learning and development. Example of our documentation includes, but are not restricted to, daily journals, anecdotal notes, final notes, recording voice, observations, conversation log, journals, pen notes, and portfolio. Documentation typically includes samples of children's work at several different stages of completion. Photographs showing work in the process, comment writing by the educator or other adult working with the children, transcriptions of children's discussions, comments, and explanations of intentions about the activity, and comments made by parents. For example, educator might take a picture of the moment when children participate in play, or they might record children's discussions, also gather children's artwork and keep them as records. So when pedagogical and documentation come together, we have pedagogical documentation. So what does it mean? Regarding lesson 2 of the Professor Jessica Phillips, pedagogical documentation means the analysis of the documentation and how their analysis helps to inform our practice. The American author Susan Stacy described pedagogical document as a teacher research. It is because this form of documentation is not only used to display for other people to see what is happening in children's learning, but it's also used to support us to gain better insights of each child in our classroom and what they have learned from our teaching, as well as what their special needs in learning and development. So pedagogical documentation is inspired by the practice of a radio-only approach. And regarding HDLP, it is explains pedagogical documentation offer a process to explore all of our questions about children. So it's always that pedagogical documentation is a natural part of early childhood education. It means we will look at the documentation that we make from collecting artifacts of children's learning and do some analysis to figure out what children's understanding, reflect our own teaching philosophy, and have an idea of what we will do next to extend children's learning opportunities. Simply, pedagogical documentation is the process of observing children's learning, collecting artifacts, and analyzing them in order to use all documentation purposefully.
So why is the pedagogical documentation useful? It is because it brings benefit to everyone. It could be educators, other staff working with children, families, and absolutely children. So remember that we document in order to share, to understand, and to be understood. In specific, the pedagogical documentation is useful because it helps us to show accountability and provide evidence of children's learning. So it helps us to learn to understand each individual children about their interests, thoughts, skills, potentialities, and way of participation and expressions. Via the visible documentations, educators as well as children can deepen their understanding and appreciate each child's uniqueness. This is the way to listen and to understand the 100 languages of children. It also supports and involves families and parents in their child's education. Parents become aware of their child's experiences at kindergarten and get possibilities to contribute in the activities. Pedagogical documentation is used as a tool for families to understand a little bit what we do with their young children in the early learning classrooms as early childhood educators. The pedagogical documentation is also help us to learn to know the dynamics in the classroom among children and children. By documenting group processes and play, educators learn from children and how they work and think together. It also reflects the relationships between children and educators. Documentation opens up possibilities for educators and children to plan activities together and be open to each other's ideas, interests, and challenges. So these things help educators to be able to extend learning. Regarding Lesson 2, Professor Phillips said, we can use documentation to help children critically reflect on their own learning and to build on what they already know. In addition, the pedagogical documentation also supports educators to do self-assessments in order to increase their professional growth. Assessing the pedagogical documentation is important as educators gain more information about the pedagogical activities, on teaching patterns, and the children's creative learning processes. So, assessing the documentation gives opportunities to develop and grow so that we can be the better educators. As pedagogical documentation makes the learning visible, regarding Lesson 2, Professor Phillips said, when we document children's learning, it becomes easier to track and respond to children's thinking, understanding, strengths, needs, and interests. In terms of what makes documentation pedagogical documentation is more than just recording the events of what were happening in the classroom. The way that documentation is used in the classroom can tell us a lot about the pedagogical approach of the educators in that classroom. Refer to ritual educator Carolina Rinaldi, suggesting that documentation is a way of listening to children that help us to learn about their children. During the course of their experiences and to make the learning visible to others for interpretation. Pedagogical documentation is an examination of the learning taking place in children and supports reflective practice and decision-making in teachers. Pedagogical documentation is the powerful tool for communicating a child's learning to families. Therefore, the documentation is pedagogical when it makes children learning visible, extends children learning, encourages family parents' involvement, respects children's work as valuable, and helps educators to plan and assess teaching philosophy for better further learning practices of young children. So what are the elements of high-quality pedagogical documentation? A high-quality teaching documentation should have the following elements. Identify the subject matter and what the most important issues are in the child's situation, what the educator should focus on, provide photos, videos, audio, artwork, and discussions, and sharing and reflection. It shows a process of children's learning and gives some examples for the viewer to understand what were happening in the learning. So now we will go to our journey through the documentation process. So first example we give you today is the not high quality documentation. This is a not high quality documentation because the information provided in this documentation is quite shallow and not depth enough. And the documentation only provided 3 pictures of a child, a title, what do you do when you are grumpy or having a bad day, and only 1 sentence from the child. I get a hug from my mom and then I feel better. So it did not give any background context in order to help us understand what was happening to this child. So we have no way to determine the reason of her anger from the documentation. There are many possibilities for this to happen, even if it has a call from this child. But this documentation did not provide much information for educators to look at and analyze what the next step they should work on to improve the child's learning. Therefore, it will be challenging for educators to build the curriculum plan based on this documentation. So the next example will be higher quality rather than the previous one. So according to this example, this one has higher quality rather than previous one documentation due to several reasons. First, this documentation is extremely informative through images and text that support us to easily understand the context of display experience and have a strong understanding of the outcomes in order to figure out what learning happened here. Obviously, in this example, we have more descriptions and details rather than the first one. And this is better than the first one because we can recognize children's interest in making TVs and remote by boxes. In addition, this example could be considered as a visual aids for viewers to imagine how display experience happen in order to be easier to build on the next step for young children to enrich their learning. However, there is some things needed to consider here are that this information is still not enough to show the process of children's learning, such as what children saying during these activities, what their ideas when problems came in this experience, and how they came up with the solution. As the interpretations here is just symbol about what we can see children were doing in this activity. It is not going a little bit deeper to understand whether children collaborated with each other well or not. It did not reflect on educators' pedagogy clearly, so it's hard for viewers to understand what educators' teaching purposely brings to the experience. Even we can have some ideas to do moving forward from this example if we attempt to create play experience based on the same topic of using process to make things, but we cannot emphasize on the actual strengths of the children in this learning. So the next example we choose is the highest quality documentation we provide for you today in our film. So this example has a very high quality and adapt for all needed requirements of one pedagogical documentation. In details, this is a 4-minute video recorded the discussion and process of children's experience of working in the coast trail and various of their learning opportunities through this work. This is a high-quality documentation as it focuses on children engagement and has a depth in gathering information through different channels such as videos, audios, as well as pictures to demonstrate what was happening in this experience. The contents in this documentation were connected and can tell a holistic story of what children learning. So it makes children learning visible. And this documentation provides detail and a lot of value and necessary information that describe how the parents taught children about animals and make comparisons of the animals' quantities that they have seen during the work. So this documentation also provides exactly what children were saying as it recorded the conversation between caregivers and children. Therefore, it helps us to understand more about what children's strengths, interests, as well as their understanding in learning happened in this experience. We are more likely to be able to imagine what learning happened and have enough foundation to plan the next coming activity to support children's abilities. So one more thing from this documentation has helped us to be easier to assess and evaluate the learning process in this activity was about images attached via this video. We can use these visuals as to recognize what specific materials that children had used in this experience as well. As educators, we can use this documentation to share with children's families and parents to encourage them their involvement in their child learning. We can notice and name the learnings in these documentations as well as be able to create meaningful plans of further learning opportunities for young children easily. So in conclusions, the pedagogical documentation supports educators involved including child development in their view, but also looking beyond development to capture broader aspects of experience for reflection. It makes children learning visible for others to interpretation. It is a tool that encourages families and parents involvement. And this is high quality documentation. Is a teacher research to help us better understand our children, and high quality documentation requires the critical reflection about what we think we know about children's learning and thinking. And educators should be based on their observations about children thinking, ideas, concepts, knowledge, and values to create a documentation. So as a result, educators must be aware of their own bias of and what of choice of their learning, the learning they value to make a high quality pedagogical documentation. And this is our references, the sources we used for our film. Thank you so much for watching.